All right, good morning. Thanks for coming to Grand Rounds this morning. Hopefully you folks can hear us online. We had the pleasure of welcoming our own Dr. George Ladero this morning. Dr. Ladero began his education at ETSU, East Tennessee State Medical Center, or University, and then went on to Ross University for his medical school training. We were lucky enough to recruit George here. And then he's going to be sticking with us for a couple more years here to do a vascular surgery fellowship. George really has been a pleasure to work with these last 5 years. Always known for his sort of soft-spoken, gentle demeanor, which we appreciate. But honestly, we've loved having George. We wish the best for George, and very interested in hearing about the origins of Cuban medical internationalism. Dr. Ladero.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. My name's George Ladero. I'm a first-generation Cuban American, and that was kind of the main reason why I chose this topic. Majority of my extended family are Cuban-trained physicians, basically from Central America and South America, and I kind of wanted to understand the reasoning for so many Cuban-trained physicians migrating out of Cuba and basically giving healthcare throughout the world, and especially the United States. Ironically, I've had several interactions with Cuban physicians during my time in Africa, also during the time I was in the Caribbean and here in the United States, and they all have pretty similar stories about their experience with the Cuban healthcare system. Probably not what you all have heard. So unfortunately, this topic is not very well publicized or talked about, but it deserves, and I hope it gives you a better understanding of what goes on in Cuba in relationship to its revolutionary efforts and how this has been an overall impetus for its foreign affairs policy and how this has basically affected the Cuban medical community for half a century. So some of the objectives for this PowerPoint are listed here. I'd like to talk about how history has kind of shaped Cuban healthcare during post, pre, and revolutionary times, how Cuban medical internationalism came about, how this also led them into being more verged on their foreign affairs efforts and medical diplomacy, and then later on, and most recently, how a lot of nations are finding out that they're using physicians as a commodity. So basically, to understand the principles and the nature of the Cuban healthcare system, we first need to discuss how Cuba's revolutionary history led Cuba to be a major contributor in global health. You can't talk about Cuban healthcare. Oh, why is that not showing up? Without speaking about these two individuals. Here on the left is a picture of Che Guevara during his time in medical training in South America. And on the right, you have Fidel Castro. He was a law student. An important time point in their revolutionary basically efforts started in 1953 for both of them. In 1953, Che Guevara was basically working on an anti-colonial liberalization movement in Guatemala, basically against the United States efforts against the president of Guatemala at that time, which was Jacob Arbenz, who was basically trying to nationalize all of the agricultural land in Guatemala. And this was something that the United States was very against because they had a lot of stock and imports from the agriculture that they were growing there. Also in 1953, Fidel Castro started the Communist Party, basically club of his law school, which had about 50 to 60 law students that basically sided with his opinions. And he was able to actually garner a lot of support with the people of the rural areas. That's this slide. So going back a little bit, prior to the revolution, before we kind of really dive into how these two people were important, there was a lot of disparities among the rural and urban communities in Cuba. Majority of the medical training and medical facilities were centralized in the urban areas, which was basically split up between two cities, San Diego and Havana. They only had one blood bank. There was 214 hospitals, and that was mainly in the urban regions, which served only 20% of the population. There was approximately 3 million people living in the rural areas, which did not have food, water, electricity, and they lived in basically huts. The literacy rate was quite poor in the rural areas. It was much better in the urban areas, only 11% illiteracy rate. And economists argue at this time that the centralized urban medical care in Cuba was just as good as the United States at that time. However, there was a huge shift between social groups, between the poor and the rich. And the main two people that kind of saw that issue were those two that we started talking about. So after the 1953 efforts in Guatemala, Castro's was actually the most important thing in the Cuban revolutionary efforts. This was basically the first shot towards the Batista regime at that time. It was the attack of Moncado barracks, and you can basically think of that as West Point. So him and 200 civilians in the rural regions, the poor people, took arms and went against this barracks to try to overtake them. They obviously did not win that battle, but this was really important. This was basically coined the first shot at Batista. Basically, his ideals were being questioned by the communist revolt. This gave Castro the trial that he desired for a 4-hour dispute on what he thought Cuba needed. So he spent 4 hours talking about the disparity of Cuban healthcare, education, basically quality of life. And this was a very famous speech that ended with the phrase called La Historia me absolverá, which means history will absolve me for my acts that I did against the barracks at Moncado. This was really important. Even though he lost, he started basically gaining more political support. A lot of left-leaning politicians joined the Communist Party. However, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison. But with that amount of support, he ended up getting those politicians to pass a bill relieving political prisoners. He ended up only serving 22 months in prison. Oops. So he was released. And in 1955, he met Che Guevara in Guatemala. And Guevara started to find out what the whole premise of the Cuban Revolution was, because he was already had revolutionary efforts in Central and South America at this time, was in a huge anti-colonial revolt against the world and imperialistic efforts. And he understood what was going on with Cuba, and he had so much resistance in Guatemala against the North American foothold in the agricultural business there that he ended up sailing with Castro in June of 1955. 3 years later, this is the most important battle of the Cuban Revolution, the Battle of Santa Cruz. This was in December 28, 1958. And this basically marked the beginning of the tipping point between the Batista movement and Castro's revolutionary victory. This was basically led by guerrilla warfare here, Castro and Che, but Che was the main person who led this battle in Santa Cruz. He derailed a railroad that was giving military supplies from Havana to Santa Cruz and used all those military equipment to overtake Santa Cruz. Batista ended up fleeing the country after this, and this garnered a lot of national support for the Cuban revolutionary movement, and also a lot of support from the Soviet Union. A year later, Cuba was invited into the Comecon, which was an economic organization of states to create cooperation among communist plan organizations and economies. And this was led and started by the Soviet Union at that time. So he now had the support he needed to address the disparities in healthcare, quality of life, and education from the USSR, but from being incorporated into this CMEA. So this also was at the privilege of the urban regions. So after a decade from the revolution, medical care plummeted, but you'll see in a couple slides how it started to improve. So stepping back, you have to understand the ideas of why they wanted to do this. Che Guevara was the one who had all the ideas of Cuban healthcare and revolutionary medicine, and he used Castro with his obviously political guardianship from his trial to basically promote these efforts. This just demonstrates a quote from Che, and their intentions were pure at the beginning, and he wanted to focus on preventative care and primary care. So it states, one day medicine will have to become a science that serves to prevent disease, orient the entire public toward their medical obligations, and that only has to intervene in cases of extreme urgency to perform some surgical operation or to deal with something uncharacteristic of the new society that we're creating. So I did not really expect to be giving this presentation when I started preparing for this about a year ago with the current world events, but we'll start to see how history is repeating itself. So in 1961, Cuba had already started building 156 new hospitals in the rural areas. And this was all basically because of their socioeconomic aid from the USSR. Preventive medicine was basically the restructuring of the medical system and medical education. So primary care was much more important than specializations. And we'll see that a lot of the people who left the country were specialized physicians. Half of the 6,000 people or physicians that were in Cuba left. And they started to restructure the medical curriculum, focusing more on what actually was true to Cuba and not so much on the North American syllabus of medical training. After that, in 1984, they had about 163 more hospitals they built in the rural regions. And in 1994, there was a total of 310 more hospitals built. But again, the mass exodus of physicians at this time during 1960s was basically shown in this graph here, how healthcare started to plummet. So you see 1970, right after the revolution, everything is starting to kind of get a little bit worse on the health status indicators. And then in the 1980s, you start seeing infant mortality go down, life expectancy is going up, things like that are starting to improve. And obviously that takes time to use this structuring and building of the infrastructure they need. And this kind of then starts to, we need to really take a step back and see how Cuba's restructuring in the 1960s help them with their more involved foreign policy initiatives and how they basically used the restructuring and their communist revolution into medical internationalism. So what is medical internationalism? We'll talk about that in a little bit, but the main thing we need to talk about is how they garner support by others to join their efforts into revolutionary medicine. So it starts with the 3 pillars of revolutionary medicine. Number 1, healthcare is free, meaning dental, visual, hospitalizations, obstetrical care, everything is free. There's healthcare for all, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your geographic location. The way they restructured and built infrastructure was able to supply healthcare to areas of the rural regions that did not have those facilities like we saw earlier in the pre-revolutionary time. And everything was government controlled. The hospitals were nationalized, the medical school was nationalized, businesses became nationalized, and this allowed the Cuban government to basically take out of the equation fair market values and third-party payers. So there wasn't insurance. So you basically had the government set the wage and that's what you got. And there was no insurance at this time. Another important part of the restructuring of the revolutionary efforts in medicine was the Revolutionary Healthcare Act of 723. This is much more important, I'd say, for medical physicians in the sense that this structured their contracts that they signed with physicians who were getting free healthcare training. So the revolutionary physician is defined in this act as a person who puts the technical knowledge of his profession at the service of the revolution and of the people. They wanted to form a new breed of physician. Profit motive was not a part of the equation. It cannot enter the analysis of your reasoning for going into medicine. The government employed and paid the physicians. So this meant physicians lost the ability for collective bargaining. Private clinics became illegal. This was something that basically was instituted by nationalizing everything and having control of all aspects of healthcare and education. What's very important though is the free medical training. And this will come to show you a little bit later that something I doubt anyone has really heard of because it's not really publicized, that the trainees for these medical educations were required to serve at least 3 years in the medical community. So that meant that Cuba decided where you would serve in either a rural region or somewhere abroad. And again, this was back to the mission of medical diplomacy. So they wanted to serve the medical downtrodden regions of the world and the people that have been forgotten in least developed countries. And that was mainly what Che Guevara and Castro initially wanted to do. So how would they do that? This is what started medical internationalism. So medical internationalism, basically Cuban medical internationalism, was a program that they created to bring medical students and patients to Cuba for training and treatment, creating medical schools in other countries and sending Cuban trained physicians globally. Medical diplomacy is a practice by which governments attempt to find solutions to overall global health solutions. And it's important to read the mission of Cuba's medical diplomacy and basically understand the first line is the cooperation offered by the Cuban government is based on free of charge delivery of health specialists and technicians, particularly family doctors for a specified term. And usually it was about 3 years, but we'll come to find out that it really wasn't just 3 years. It was a lot longer. Some other things that we need to talk about are how this medical internationalism helped with more global disaster relief. So they were very active during the Chernobyl crisis. They actually sent 20,000 patients from Chernobyl to Cuba to have medical care and surgical care. Also during Hurricane George, the disaster relief in Haiti and earthquakes and other disaster reliefs in South and Central America. Castro and Che were much more concerned about the global health issues of Central and South America. And later on, you'll see how those efforts from Central and South America were actually forgotten, and they started to go and assist Sub-Saharan Africa. So here is basically a list of all the medical schools created or developmental assistance from the timeline of 1976 till 2004. And this, again, was similar to what they started. This was basically international socialism. What is that? This is the perception of all communist revolutions as being part of a single global class struggle rather than a separate localized events. So Castro to himself was taking on the notion that I have to be the savior of all these least developed and downtrodden people, everyone who's forgotten. I'm going to find a way to assist them because no one else is doing it. And then we start to talk about how this starts to get really juicy here. So Havana's healthcare delivery program is very important in how it interplays with its larger and very complex foreign policy interests and concerns. Cuba's international role in healthcare is a significant factor in defining how Cuba came to be and what Cuban revolutionary events led them to be such a major player in the global stage. Unfortunately, this is a topic that is very difficult to find a lot of literature on. There's only two texts about this. One is called Healing the Masses, and the other one is called Medical Internationalism, Origins, Evolutions, and Goals. Outside of those two texts, it's very, very bare. There's no real systematic studies or reviews about medical internationalism from an academic standpoint. But even more concerning is that the Cuban government has almost non-existent documentation of this. All the documentation is from other countries that have been involved with Cuba's medical diplomacy efforts. But the question in a lot of these literature and a lot of the text is, what is the relationship of Cuba's medical aid program to Havana's larger foreign policy goals? What is their strategy? What are they trying to get out of this? Well, we kind of talked about what their main efforts was to help the least developed countries, all the people that the rest of the world has forgot he wants to help. But what is the primary historical events that facilitated Cuba's medical aid program? So you know that the United States has put a large embargo on Cuba. So how are they able to garner so much outreach if one of the biggest superpowers in the world is not giving them any type of import or export? And finally, what are the major constraints that have changed their medical mission that they confronted during history and how that had really affected what their initial mission was? So to unravel this question and leading to how similar events are happening now, we have to talk about the Cold War and their relationship with Russia. So there's three main events during this time frame. First, we need to talk about how Cuba's history will depict how its medical diplomacy assisted Cuba in becoming a significant player on the world stage. But I want you all to ask yourself throughout these slides, how can a country so small that has been basically embargoed by one of the biggest superpowers in the world have such outreach and economic, without economic support? They had more global health efforts than all the G8 countries combined, which is a lot. So if you don't know what the G8 countries are, it's France, Germany, Italy, Japan, United Kingdom, United States, Canada, and Russia. They had more people helping from that little country than all of them combined, which it's amazing. And it should ask you a question, how are they doing this? So to start, you have to understand why there's so much hostility from the US and how Cuba responded to this. So they were dealing between a little dance between the USSR and the Soviet Union and the United States. That's something that the Cold War everyone should know about. But the main reasons that led to this was Castro's efforts in Africa and how he was basically trying to liberate all his national liberation movements and how he was starting to involve medical diplomacy into those liberation movements. The first instance of medical diplomacy was in Algeria, and this was between the border dispute between Algeria and Morocco. Next important aspect of his medical diplomacy was in Zaire, and this was led by Che. And this was the first instance of mass vaccination in Africa for polio. And Washington was, to be quite frank, they were pretty fed up with Fidel Castro at this time. During the Cold War, their efforts in Sub-Saharan Africa, Central America, and South America was always complete opposite of what Castro wanted to do. And this kind of is what led to the Bay of Pigs and eventually the Cuban Missile Crisis. So basically telling the United States to go kick rocks, Castro started to cozy up with the USSR. He publicly endorsed the Warsaw Pact's invasion of Czechoslovakia, which is basically led by the Soviet Union, similar to what is going on now. And he also agreed with the Breben Doctrine. The Breben Doctrine basically stated, again, something important to the socialist movement, which was Soviet Union policy that proclaimed any threat to the socialist rule in any state of the Soviet bloc, Central or Eastern Europe, is a threat against them all and should be justified by the intervention of all fellow socialist states. So after he endorsed these things, the USSR was like, okay, well, we're going to invite you into the CMEA. Well, this was a Council of Mutual Economic Assistance. This was what Castro really needed to continue his foreign policy aid and the relationship with that and medical internationalism. He didn't have the funding, he didn't have the socioeconomic aid or the subsidies, so the USSR supplied those. And this allowed them to become much more active on the world stage and to be a huge player in foreign affairs, and being so small and isolated that the United States had isolated them for such a long time. That's how they were able to do that. And during that time, the U.S.'s support and the subsidies were at its height. He used this to continue creating more medical outreach programs. So he started creating more infrastructure in least developed countries. He started creating more medical schools. He started being much more diplomatic in his efforts. And we see here now his mission is not really being followed, because we're starting to see documentation of his reimbursement for these medical diplomacy efforts. The first instance of that was in Libya, and he's received $150 million in reimbursement for sending Cubans in medical assistance, also with construction and infrastructure of Libya, with schools, hospitals, and also military aid. And the next example would be during the Angola War, but this was more so a veil of military assistance. He only gave 800 physicians, but the liberalization movement effort he was much more interested in, and he sent 50,000 troops there, and he ended up receiving 50 million reimbursement. And physicians only saw 850 bucks out of that a year. And then more and more contracts are starting to be seen, and things started to be documented. So they can't really hide what was going on, even though the efforts and the ideas, and they were helping a lot of people. That's true. No one's going to refute that. But the way that they're doing it is becoming a little more concerning of how are they getting funded for this? How are physicians doing this for only $850 a year? So this is a picture of some Cuban development assistance aids abroad. This is from the origins of medical internationalism. And you'll come to start to see that a lot of the assistance that he was giving was more so to least developed countries, and he did not really require people with much more communist views to give him reimbursement. So, for example, Nicaragua during the Sandinista movement was the most assisted during that time of the Western Hemisphere, and he did not require any type of reimbursement from them. However, Iran and Iraq were paying him a lot in oil. Also, you can see here, Angola was at the same time dealing with anti-colonial efforts, and he supplied a lot of medical aid during that time. So basically seeing, again, similar to the Breben Doctrine, he is incorporating more of his communist allies in a more communal effort to, I'm going to assist you. Eventually, you may have to repay me. Then Cuba came into this portion that a lot of economists call the special period, which is a time after or the ending of the Cold War. The USSR subsidies basically halved. Cuba's economy was on the downward spiral. And this was a special period for Castro because it put him in a position that went completely reverse of what Che wanted to do. Che was dead by this time, and there's a lot of speculation that there are arguments about medical diplomacy is what led to his death over Argentina, but that's neither here nor there. So Castro needed an alternative source of income for these medical efforts, and USSR was not doing that for them. So that's this picture here is Hugo Chavez. He was the guy who was in charge of Venezuela around 2006, and he became partners with Fidel Castro at that time to help continue expanding the ELAM, which is Escuela Latinoamérica Médicos, based Latin American medical school program. And he was giving Fidel Castro 100,000 barrels of oil a month, which equated at that time $300 million a month for producing physicians in all the Cuban facilities that they created in the Caribbean Basin, Venezuela, and other areas of Central and South America. And he expanded the program significantly at that time. And they were producing about 100,000 physicians every 5 years. That's a lot. So why is that important? Well, Cuba was seeing $11 billion in revenue yearly at this time. This is something that finally had been public record. In 2010, the United Nations posted this value. They also started to be focusing more on health tourism. People were being brought into Cuba for healthcare. And this, again, would come to the fault of the Cuban people. They wouldn't be receiving healthcare because they were focusing more on health tourism. So in 1996, 7,000 health tourists came in and they received $25 million for that. In 2003, 5,000 health tourists came in. This again was starting to show that the highest producer of GDP at that time was medical internationalism. And here is just an image of the medical collaboration map in 2016. These are all the efforts worldwide that Cuba had in 2016, which is pretty impressive. And I guess the question I had in my mind is, how are they able to do this? And then it's starting to show that they're using physicians as a commodity because they're paying them this. This is from the Havana survey in 2000, how much the medical personnel were getting paid on an annual basis. So that says $182. 60 to 90% were getting $182 to $349. But benefit of the doubt, the organizations that were hosting those people were supplying lodging, transportation, and stipends. But I also want to read, this is a very important point. During the Healthcare Act, there was an article 135.1, because what is concerning to me is, why are Cuban physicians still doing this? Why are people okay with this? They're leaving their family for 3 years, and this is what they're making. Well, Article 135.1 stipulates that the official or employee in charge of fulfilling a mission in a foreign country that abandons it, or once it has completed or required any time to return, refuses expressly or tacitly to do so, incurs punishment of deprivation of freedoms for 3 to 8 years at least. Again, this was not the initial mission that Che and Castro wanted. Was it the fact that all these events during the Cold War led him to be in this position that he had to exploit physicians as a commodity? I don't know. I can't answer that question. But looking at this now, it's kind of concerning. So physicians as a commodity. There's a paucity of literature on this, and it's very concerning to me that this is not more publicly known. The topic is really startling about how Cuba's medical diplomacy efforts globally have left a paper trail of contractual interactions with other governments. People are seeing that is actually happening. And the first instance of this crisis was with the Mais Medico program. This program was a program between Brazil and the PAHO, which is an arm of the United Nations. And this program claimed that Brazil was short on assistance to the more impoverished areas of Brazil. And they reached out to the PAHO, who then supplied 5,000 doctors in August of 2013 between a legal document between Brazil, the PAHO, and an organization that Cuba created called Médicos Cubanos Comercializados, basically meaning commercialized doctors. And this was not a sanctioned list in the United States at that time. Cuba was sanctioned, but this organization they created was not sanctioned. So what was concerning about this program? Well, I hope you start to see that Cuba supplied 5,000 doctors a year, a total of 15 to 20,000 doctors between 2013 to 2017. And according to the records between the Brazil and the Cuban embassy, this was all coordinated through the organizations that they created. They were the only physicians that were being garnered their salary through a third-party organization. All other doctors from all other countries were receiving their payment directly. So the record started to show that Cuba subjected their people to substandard rules of overseas medical missions. And this constituted forced labor under the International Labor Organization and human trafficking under national and international law. Examples of this, if you're still skeptical. Doctors worked less than 10% of the fair market value. They were separated from their families. They were restricted from interacting with locals. They had a Cuban international intelligence agent who was living with them during their time there to watch what they were doing. Doctors were also placed under 24-hour surveillance. They were required to engage in political indoctrination, meaning promoting the revolutionary movement. And over the past 5 years, from 2013 to 2018, Cuba saw $1.5 billion a year from this program. Which is even more concerning is that the PAHO saw $75 million. They were getting a little cut from that. And this was a branch of the United Nations that this was going on. President Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, found this out. He's like, oh my God, I am literally condoning slave labor right now. And he withdrew his contract from there, but Castro had something better to say. He's like, no, I'm quitting before you quit. And all the medical doctors need to come back. He wanted all the 20,000 doctors to come back immediately, which was concerning though, because a lot of them did go back. And Brazil offered all those physicians passports and Brazilian citizenship and fair market values, but only 2,000 of the 20,000 stayed. Why? That doesn't make any sense. Well, the International Labor Organization and now the new organization called Cuban Doctors Human Rights published this article here of 9 out of the 10 labor rights that Cuba has been violating for the past 50 years on its Cuban physicians. This is something that's not very well known. I was actually surprised that my parents didn't really talk about this much more when I was asking them about their education. So basically a violation of human rights and international labor laws. And the following 9 points are just the tipping point of what Cuba has been doing. And it started with the contract of Maíz Médico, which basically exposed what Castro has been doing. Later on, those 2,000 physicians, 4 of them actually ended up getting United States citizenship, and they filed a lawsuit against the United Nations arm, the PAHO, because they were basically turning their face to what was going on and saying, you are United Nations, PHO, you guys have got $75 million a year and you're understanding what the conditions are and you were okay with that. So they ended up going to suit in Miami with this, and I think this was in 2019. So after that lawsuit, the United Nations was basically under very big magnifying glass from the global health community. They ended up creating an an internal review committee to investigate basically what everyone was saying, and these doctors sued the United Nations about of their agreements with human trafficking and human labor. Eventually, this led to this special task force, and they quoted at the end, read it, basically stating the medical missions have provided medical care for a large number of people who would otherwise not have had access to healthcare. However, we want to express we are very concerned about the work and living conditions affecting Cuban doctors sent abroad to provide their services. This is where this organization started to become much more involved, the Cuban Doctors Human Rights Organization. Here's some articles of the review of the investigation on Brazil and the Maíz Médico's contract. Again, it's a little bit of the stuff we already talked about. Brazil terminated the contract. Cuba saw $6.3 billion a year from this, and physicians were prohibited from acquiring their documentation, meaning you landed in Brazil and they took your passport, so you couldn't leave. Also, Cuban doctors were the only physicians in that program that had their salaries garnered by the Cuban government and not directly given to them by the PAHO. And there's some of the documentation from the internal review committee. So backtrack a little bit. The United States kind of already knew a little bit about this, and they created this program called the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Program. This was a program that allowed Cuban physicians to seek refuge in the United States from their brigade ships abroad. This allowed them to bring family members with them too. But what is even more concerning is that a lot of people didn't use this program, and that was kind of puzzling to me. And this was, me and my sister talked about this last night. My dad would have said these ridiculous things that, oh yeah, you can't go to Cuba. I don't want you to go visit. Why? And I was like, why can I go visit where you're from? So then he started telling me, according to him, one of our cousins went back and he actually did have his passport withheld. So people who retaliated against the Cuban government during this parole program and left family back in Cuba, there's instances of people that were left in Cuba, those family members going under imprisonment, withholding medical care to those individuals, family members left in Cuba, withholding food and water, harassment to the family members, and revoking their travel documents as well. Later on, this is actually a bill, because that bill was actually rescinded in 2017, and this is a new bill that has been presented to Congress, basically titled Combating Trafficking of Cuban Doctors Act of 2021. And this continues to show how this is becoming much more politicized and more people are talking about it, and how medical internationalism program really wasn't what it was started to be. And this was presented to the Senate by Senator Mark Rubio. This was a bipartisan bill, and Senator Mendez from New Jersey, Democratic senator. They also discuss other instances of this issue. They start talking about how the state trafficking agency basically categorized Cuba as a tier 3 state trafficker or human trafficker. And they also again start to discuss other instances of their foreign medical missions by how they've been withholding passports from medical credentials, and also how they use minders and restricting the physicians' movements. Another instance, again, the more concerning thing that what I understood and what I experienced with my family was the retaliation against the family members that you left in Cuba and how they imposed criminal penalties and exile and family separation on those physicians that defected and used that CMP program. And again, this also talks about how in Venezuela, they coerce medical doctors to withhold medical care for opposing political viewpoint patients. So if you didn't agree with the viewpoint of, this was during the time between Hugo Chavez and now the President Maduro, and these physicians were basically promoting political viewpoints in their healthcare. And this was overseen by those Cuban intelligence officers who were basically dictating how they were dispersing healthcare to people who did not have the same revolutionary beliefs. This is a severe form of trafficking, and this is starting to be seen much more well-known worldwide. So 30 medical schools have been created by Cuba globally. Only 90% of those graduates are actually practicing in those countries that they're from or where they train in medical school. So a large majority of these doctors are going wherever Cuba decides where they need to go. To date, 300,000 medical personnel have been dispersed worldwide through the Medical Internationalism program. And now yearly, Cuba is seeing $11 billion in payment to the government through either oil, military equipment, or cash. This is very concerning, and I think that this has not received any media that it should be. And it's time for accountability from the medical community, the United Nations, and from the global health community at large. We need to acknowledge that this is a bigger issue than what has actually been documented in the literature. So here's some more instances after another lawsuit by another group of Cuban physicians that started to see that this was starting to be published in the news a little bit more. And in 2007, the World Politics reported that Cuba has had a long tradition of sending doctors to treat the poor overseas under forced labor conditions, work in servitude in such areas, and forced against their free will to serve outside of Cuba. Another instance in this lawsuit was another article that was discussed about trafficking persons report in 2003 listed Cuba as one of the worst offenders of human trafficking in 2003, but they did not report it till 2010. The Wall Street Journal also reported in 2011 that Cuba was sending medical brigades to foreign countries since 1973, which is 5 years after almost a decade after the revolution, for hard currency. And they were seeing almost $8 billion a year in this. This is state-sponsored human trafficking at its best. And this works directly with the health authorities in other countries and have no say in their assignments either. Another example from the lawsuit is more mainstream media was becoming involved with this. You can see here that one of the congressmen was basically stating that human beings are, well, that's not there. Well, the Wall Street Journal here also had an article talking about the slave trade and the human trafficking. Reuters discussed about the harsh working conditions, and then the Forbes quoted several doctors basically saying, "We are the highest qualified slave labor force in the world." So this is very concerning, and it's time for accountability. The PHO lawsuit versus the Cuban doctors was basically what started exposing this issue, and there are steps being made. There's countries now that are withdrawing from the Cuban diplomacy agreements. El Salvador, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Brazil are of some of them that are now no longer using contracts with Cuba in their medical diplomacy efforts. But there's still a lot of countries that are supporting this physician trafficking. Venezuela is the main supporter at this time. Mexico, Haiti, Argentina, Bahamas, Dominica, Nicaragua, Peru, and many more. And it's very concerning. And luckily, there's two organizations that have been very vocal about this. And it'd be the Cuban Doctors Human Rights Movement and the Human Rights Watch. Luckily, the Human Rights finally condemned what was going on in Cuba, and they recently published on their website this quote: "The Cuban government continues to repress dissent and deter public criticism. It routinely relies on arbitrary detention and harasses and intimidates critics, independent activists, protesters, others, especially physicians. Other repressive tactics employed by the government include public acts of shaming and arbitrary termination of employment. The U.S. embargo continues to provide the Cuban government with an excuse for its problems. a pretext for its abuses, and a way to garner sympathy abroad with governments that might otherwise have been willing to condemn the country's repressive practices more vocally. This is something that the Cuban community, refugees in the United States, have been saying for quite some time, but no one really listens to them. So, sadly, this is something, again, that is not very well publicized, and this is a picture of a famous speech that Fidel Castro gave when the United States basically put all their embargo. He basically just gave a very long speech, and at the end of the speech, there was a term he continued to say frequently: "Patria o muerte," means homeland or death. And this was basically a response to the U.S. blockade and how his anti-colonial efforts were being strong-armed by the United States. But the people of Cuba now are speaking out and claiming patria or muerte, or vida, which basically means homeland and life. And this is an anti-communist, anti-Castro movement that people in the country are stating, because now they're starting to see the repressive acts that he's been instilling among them for many, many years. There's some people that have been affected by the Cuban government's Medical Diplomacy Act. And pictured here, we have been fortunate enough, though, some of these are my family and one of the Bachelor Fellows who actually trained in Cuba and fled Cuba. It's just fortunate that we can call the United States our homeland and create a life outside of Castro's reach. If it weren't for the policies and the programs that allowed my family to come to the United States, I probably wouldn't be giving you this presentation today. And if you all get something out of this presentation, I just hope it's that you understand what the Cuban people and the Cuban medical community have been going through. And the next time you meet a Cuban trained physician in the United States of America, you know what they have gone through to get here. So I appreciate your time, and God bless America. Yeah. Yeah, so they had over 30 medical schools created prior to that, and then expansion with Venezuela basically almost tripled that. So they weren't really like legit. Some of the schools were in sub-Saharan Africa, so there were just little huts and hovels where they taught basic medical care. But it was estimated that almost 100,000 doctors every 5 years, which is, I don't know, it seems like a lot. Yeah. Yeah. That's why it was kind of concerning that their outreach is so broad, and they're such a small and economically shielded country from the United States that to do that, you have to be exposing something to be able to do that. And we are seeing now how they've been exposing the medical community for almost half a century. Yeah. Oh, so if you go to Cuba, you'll see that a lot of the individuals working in tourism are actually retired doctors and engineers, because they'll make more in tourism owning like a cart on the side of the road through basically getting money from the American dollar than what they'd be doing this. Some people, though, use this as a way out. So my parents used the school in Venezuela to leave, and then they ended up getting scholarships for residency in the United States, and then were granted visas due to that scholarship. So some of the people used it as a way out because they couldn't get out. Yes? Yes. 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 Yeah, it was Yep. Yeah, the interplay with their foreign policy, it's so complex, and you could spend a month talking about it, of all the different communications and all the relationships that he built to let this happen. Especially in South Africa, actually, I was reading an article about their COVID relief in South Africa, and there was almost 30% of the medical personnel were unemployed there, but they still were using Cuban physicians there. And this was a big backlash by the medical community in South Africa, but they still brought, I think it was 5,000 to 10,000 Cuban physicians this year there. So it is a big issue, and I'm very shocked when I started reading it. I never even thought that this was, because my parents told me all this stuff, and I thought, this is not true. And then I started reading, and I was like, oh my God, this is real. And I called my dad yesterday, like, I'm sorry for not believing you, but there's actually documentation about what you've been telling me. Because a stubborn child didn't believe his dad. So actually, that's a great question. Any of the applicants that were interested in, during, I think, the 1960s, basically had to show support of the revolutionary movement, and they were involved in that program. Yeah. Like Cuba or. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's a great question. So there's actually only one medical school, the main one in Havana of Cuba. Majority of those numbers that I was telling you was from all the medical schools that they created, which was basically garnered by medical professionals and teachers that were Cuban, initial Cuban doctors that were teaching the medical schools. But a lot of the outreach that they created, the infrastructure in other countries was what allowed this number to really propagate. But no, a majority of them are not being brought into Cuba. Majority of them are training in their home country, where they built developmental assistance, medical schools, and hospitals, and those locals are being trained there. And what was concerning is that 90% of them aren't even staying there. 90% of them are going somewhere else because they signed to be worked for 3 years at least. And then we found out that it wasn't really 3 years. It was almost up to 8 years that they were working. And then you had repercussions if you tried to leave. And you also, another key point is, once you finished your term, you had to come back. You had to come back to Cuba to get your travel documentation. You couldn't just be done and just stay in Brazil. Yes. Yep. So Darian, so he did medical school twice, residency twice. My parents did twice, everything twice. The residency twice, fellowship twice. Yeah. And I think there was it was called Fifth Pathway. It's like, I don't know if that's the same thing. Now it's more like ECFMG kind of examinations. But before, when my dad did it in the 70s or 80s, it was a different type of examination. And actually, during the pre-revolutionary time, when that mass exodus of physicians left Havana, the United States actually let them sit for medical boards, US boards, and if they passed, they could come to the United States. So half of those physicians that exiled actually came to the United States. Right. Well, thank you for your time.